Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. In today's presentation, I will discuss about the effect of COVID-19 pandemic towards small medium enterprise for tourism industry. Before I start, let me introduce myself. My name is Khairul Najwa binti Muhammad Tua and my metric number is 275654. In this presentation, we will briefly discuss regarding the introduction, point of writing, current situation, data and finding, discussion and conclusion. Firstly, we will discuss on the introduction. SMEs are considered as the major source of job creation, about 70% of job on average. SMEs made up to 45% of all employment and 33% of GDP on emerging economies. Tourism is considered as a significant economic activity due to both direct and indirect economic effect. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic in December 2019, it definitely had great impact on the global tourism industry. Next, I will presenting about the point of writing for service learning project. In this report, we will investigate how the coronavirus or COVID-19 affect the tourism industry. Next, we will look into how the company gets around this problem. And lastly, tackle on how the government might assist the tourism industry in light of the effect of COVID-19. For current situation, I will discuss on the tourism industry generally. The disruption to travel and tourism caused by COVID-19 is far more severe and will persist of much longer period than the combined effect of the 9/11 attack in 2001, the SARS pandemic in 2003, and the global financial crisis in 2008. Three main categories may be used to categorize the consequence of the pandemic on tourism, which is firstly government travel restriction, secondly event cancellation such as trade shows, congresses, conferences, cultural events and athletic events, and lastly traveler anxiety over the chance of getting the disease. Many tourist SMEs were among those most severely affected by the pandemic during the COVID-19 crisis and are currently experiencing large revenue decreases. This is particularly important since SMEs who make up over 75% of all job sectors that are indirectly impacted by COVID-19 lockdown measures are notably at significant higher risk.
Following that, we will select 4 countries at a random to discuss their present tourist business scenario. To begin, before the epidemic wreaked havoc on the economy, travel tourism in the Philippines contributed around 47.8 billion in goods and services, or 12.7% of the gross domestic product. 8.26 million international visitors visited the Philippines, spending 11 billion. The remaining 36.6 billion came from domestic tourism. In terms of employment, the industry directly employed 1.3 million of the countrymen. Considering all variables, it is impossible to imagine a complete economic recovery without the resumption of travel. However, according to the most current forecast, the number of international tourists and the amount of money spent by them would both fall to 3.9 million and 279.5 billion in 2020 respectively. The government aid was fairly minimal, consisting of longer credit periods for permit application, a few tax exemption and financial help for small and medium-sized firms. The nation's leading airline and hotel company have not received the essential financial help. There has been a rise of more than 11% in the number of tourists, firms declaring bankruptcy, and there will be more if tourism and travel are not made more accessible. Travel limitations imposed by COVID have resulted in widespread unemployment and firm closure, as well as inconceivable misery for individuals working in tourism across the world. Nonetheless, the country must seize the opportunity to rebuild the sector by aiding players in upgrading and digitizing their operation, rethinking how they conduct business, and guaranteeing compliance with appropriate safety and health regulations. Singapore is up next. Singapore observed a decline in the number of visitors visiting the nation in 2020, as well as a fall in the money generated by tourism as a result of those travellers. The ongoing application of cross-border travels restriction has had substantial detrimental impact on Singapore's tourist sector. The outbreak has had an impact on the tourism industry, which is still struggling as a result of fewer arriving tourists. Companies in the tourist sector have been benefited from a number of government aid initiatives, allowing them to modify their goods and services while simultaneously developing new skills to position themselves for future growth opportunities. As per the Singapore Tourism Board (STB), the Orchard Road and Marina Bay areas accounted for 76% of overall retail expenditure by visitors while they were in the nation. Businesses in these precincts have been hurt more than those in the other precincts since they were formerly sustained by tourist retail spending. The Orchard Road region suffered the most since visitors spent over half of their total retail expenditure there, which is 52%, while the Marina Bay zone got only 24% of visitor spending. Furthermore, Sentosa Harbourfront, Marina Bay and Orchard were the most popular important tourism zone among visitors. Sentosa Harbourfront attracted the most visitors, accounting for 25% of all visitors. The second most frequented main tourism location was Orchard Road, followed by Marina Bay. Marina Bay and Orchard Road had substantial foot traffic, accounting for 22% and 16% of total traffic respectively. This was followed by other tourist areas such as Bugis for 8%, Chinatown for 6% and Little India for 4%. Even during this difficult year, Singapore tourism-related industry contributed significantly to the country's fight against COVID-19. Hotels were eager to rent out their facility for a number of purposes, including government quarantine facilities, swab isolation facilities, and stay-home notice dedicated facility, or SDFs. As an example, since March 2020, more than 70 hotels have served as SDF at various periods. SDF have provided housing for more than 80,000 people on stay-home notice as of 31st December 2022, with the support of over 2,300 frontline hotel workers. The tourism sector in Malaysia was already under threat owing to the coronavirus epidemic that began in early 2020. Travel restrictions imposed by many nations to prevent the virus spread resulted in a significant decrease in the number of Singaporean and Chinese visitors. Tourists suffered significant financial losses as a result of this. This is especially true in the hotel and airline businesses. Furthermore, as a result of the coronavirus, many tour guides are now out of work due to a shortage of gas and execution. As a result, local businesses and street sellers that rely on tourists will suffer. As an example, Kampung Kacang Putih, a famous snack shop in Ipoh, reported an 80% drop in sales as a result of the pandemic. To restore the country's tourism business, the Malaysian Ministry of Tourism has focused on internal travel and marketing Malaysia as a safe holiday destination. Another strategy to encourage people to travel within the country is to provide discount and incentive. Domestic tourism has the ability to reinvigorate the travel sector. Domestic travel is more accessible, has more transit alternative, and has less limitation than foreign travel in the majority of countries. Malaysia's economy is primarily dependent on the tourism and hospitality industry. In 2019, the industry created 20.6 billion in economic value and 3.6 million jobs, accounting for 15.9% of the country's GDPs and attracting 26.1 million international tourists. After the outbreak, international immigration plummeted by 83.4%, reaching just 4.3 million people in 2020. Hotel occupancy rate have also fallen from 64% in 2019 to little over a third, 23 to 32% in 2020. Since then, Malaysia has relied primarily on domestic traveller, with exceptions such as opening the Langkawi tourism bubble to foreign visitor and establishing the vaccinated travel lane (VTL) for passengers who have received all recommended vaccination while travelling between Malaysia and Singapore. Aside from that, the government reduced on domestic travel expenses up to 1,000 ringgit, which is US dollar 228, to encourage domestic tourism. This will remain until December 31st, 2022. The full reopening of the border has placed Malaysia tourist industry on the mend. Malaysia is also focusing on smart tourism, which comprises the digitization and building of smart goods and infrastructure in order to defend a robust and sustainable tourism industry against impending disasters such as another pandemic. Furthermore, Malaysia has strengthened health and safety in response to prior pandemic scenario in order to ensure that the industry can give significant economic advantages. Destination must create an image of being easily accessible, safe and compliant with approved COVID-19 travel requirements that do not interfere with travelers' plan. Even if travelers are lured to nations that appear safer than their own, the safety message may be reinforced alongside the destination other benefits. Rapid digitization has had a significant impact on persons working in the tourism industry, such as those who book hotels. As a result, in the future, they must access how new technologies such as e-commerce platform will affect front and back office activities, such as providing a seamless customer experience and increasing efficiency. Furthermore, as a result of the pandemic, customers would desire more contactless items and services, compelling the industry to respond sooner or later. Pandemic restrictions have impacted Thailand's once thriving international tourist business, although Thailand reopened to foreign visitors from 63 countries on November 1st, 2021. The government has been working to improve local tourism as well as help in the revival of international demand since then. Other tourism-reliant nations should learn from Thailand's experience as they prepare to resume international travel even as new strains of the virus are detected throughout the world. Thailand comeback appears to be on the horizon. Thailand tourism sector may not recover to pre-crisis level until 2024, assuming a recurrence of the virus, weak long-term growth, a muted global recovery and small changes to global tourism rules. Because Thailand's GDP is strongly reliant on foreign tourism income, the local tourist industry alone would not be sufficient to return the country's tourism profit to 2019 level. The sector resuscitation would be dependent on an increase in international travel. Globally, this recovery scenario would most likely affect the travel industry environment and create a strong need for both the public and private sector to take action to ensure the industry's survival. Thailand's main economic agency stated on Tuesday that country's GDP increased by 2.2% in the first quarter due to rebound in export and tourism following the relaxation of pandemic restriction. I will continue with the data and findings after that. First, let's look at international tourist arrival. The table below displays the data for foreign tourist arrival in many areas including Europe, Asia Pacific, America, Africa and in the Middle East from 2017 to 2020. In 2019, Europe has the biggest number of tourist arrival, which is 744.30 million, compared to the Middle East area, which has the lowest number of foreign visitor arrival, which is 64.20 million. Overall, based on the territories mentioned above, the number of visitors declined drastically in 2020 as the pandemic onslaught prompted all nations to lock their borders and limit travel, which had a knock-on effect on the tourism industry. Finally, the conclusion of this study suggested that the COVID-19 has had an impact on the tourist sector. Tourists believe that the COVID-19 outbreak has heightened their health worries and has forced them to rethink their vacation plan for specific region. To halt the spread of COVID-19, government in each nation have limited visitor travel. Aside from that, the entrance of overseas visitors in the year 2020 was declining since 2020 is the year with the highest number of COVID-19 cases. This is owing to the government's directive to block the country borders and limit visitor travel. Not only may persons from outside the country enter the country, but the citizen of the country cannot leave the country. Next, the primary issue follows. This diagram depicts a pie chart of the major challenges that the tourist business faced during the COVID-19 outbreak. The pie graphic depicts 5 major difficulties, including demand decrease, assistance reduction, credit closure, debt growth, and investment reduction. The key difficulties that need to be examined based on the challenges include demand reduction, where when the pandemic starts, individuals are compelled to stay at home and movement is also restricted. This is done to make the virus physical movement and transmission less harmful. Among the other concerns, demand reduction achieved the largest proportion, which is 30%, while mounting debt obtained the second highest percentage with the 23%. Since the tourist industry does not earn enough profit to fund their operation business as demands fall, the tourist industry is also suffering credit closure, with 22% of the overall percentage unable to get and apply for new loans or credit due to the same difficulty as banking institutions during the epidemic. Financial institutions may not have the cash to offer them, which may cause lending in the tourist sector to cease. When the quantity of tourists decline, so does the tourist demand. Consider the desire for keepsakes. Consider the popularity of souvenirs. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government decision is also having an effect on souvenir dealers. Not only that, but hotel, Airbnb, and other locations where travelers generally stay during their vacation are also affected. They are unable to produce profit while paying their staff, resulting in a decline in employee numbers. Then, there is the November 2020 travel restriction. The figure shows a bar graph depicting the form of travel restriction in percentage term as of November 2020. Quarantine destination specific travel restriction, total or partial border closure, negative PCR test, alternative measure, and the relaxation of the COVID-19 travel restriction are all examples of travel limitation. According to the bar graph, the region that entirely locked their nation border beyond 50% is Asia Pacific, with a proportion of 59% indicating that the region is severely trying to control the COVID-19 virus. by not allowing individuals from outside or overseas to enter their country. Meanwhile, Europe is more focused on partial border disclosure with 67% and the largest proportion of other areas, but they are not stringent and focus on totally closing border, with region having the lowest number of 7% compared to other regions. Aside from that, the Americas and Middle East have travel restriction in the form of PCR tests, where tourists or visitors must acquire a negative PCR test in order to enter the nations. America and Middle East had the largest percentage of negative PCR testing, 55 and 46% respectively among the other areas. Following that, I will go through the average spending per trip. The table depicts the average spending per tourist trip from 2019 to 2020. Tourist expenditure is increasing year after year. In 2019, visitors spent $100,000, which is less than in 2020, when they spent $1,300, which is more than in 2019. By 2020, the average visitor spending per trip will have increased by $300. Furthermore, $1,400 is the average spending per trip in 2021, which is higher than in 2019 and 2020. In 2020, the average visitor spending per trip will grow by $100. In conclusion, we can say that during the pandemic, average spending increased because travelers needed to stay longer in certain areas and regions that did not allow them to live due to state government movement restriction, and the need or willingness that forced them to spend more in the destination. This is why during the epidemic, the average expenditure each trip increased. Finally, the data and finding are economic contribution of tourism to GDP. The graph below depicts the tourist direct gross domestic product from 2019 to 2020. When compared to the years 2020 and 2021, the economic contribution of tourism to GDP in 2019 would be the largest at USD 3.5 trillion. This is because the tourism industry is still in full gear during that year, and there are no crises or condition like as the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses are also operating normally and demand in the tourism industry remain robust. Tourism direct GDP is expected to fall drastically to USD 1.6 trillion in 2020, down from 1.9 trillion in 2015. Because the pandemic occurs in 2020, it may have an impact on the tourist sector in terms of demand and profit gain, resulting in a fall in GDP. Meanwhile, the tourist direct GDP in 2021 indicates a minor growth of USD 0.3 trillion, while the overall GDP in 2021 is USD 1.9 trillion, since borders in certain places have been opened and demand is beginning to rise. Next, for the discussion, the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant influence on all commercial sectors, including tourism. It also caused an unprecedented level of disruption to tourism, with global demand plummeting in the midst of widespread lockdown and travel restriction imposed by nations in an effort to stop the virus from spreading further, resulting in enormous economic and social ramifications that put over 100 million direct tourist jobs at risk. When compared to 2019, the global coronavirus pandemic resulted in a 72% decline in foreign visitor arrival in 2020 and a 71% decrease in 2021. Over this course of the 2 years, this equates to a loss of 2.1 billion international arrival. As a result, the amount of money obtained from exporting items connected to international tourism fell by 63% in 2020 and 61% in 2021, resulting in a 22.1 trillion loss over the course of the 2 years. Furthermore, the economic contribution of tourism in 2019 is the largest when compared to the year 2021 and 2022. This is because the tourism sector was still in full flow that year with no crisis or situation like as the COVID-19 epidemic. Tourism direct GDP is predicted to shrink dramatically from USD 1.9 trillion in 2010 to USD 1.6 trillion in 2020. This is because the pandemic happened in 2020, which may have influenced on the tourism business in terms of demand and profit gain, leading in a drop in GDP. Meanwhile, the tourist direct GDP in 2021 is expected to increase by USD 0.3 trillion, increasing the overall GDP in 2021 to USD 1.9 trillion since borders in certain regions have been opened and demand is beginning to rise. Despite this, foreign tourism is expected to recover slightly in the second half of 2021. To summarize, this rapidly expanding and lethal virus has caused concern in many travel and hospitality sectors throughout the world. Trauma from lost job, recuperation for an early stage small firm, and hiding financial difficulty may all require time in the post-COVID-19 period. The COVID-19 pandemic confirmed Malaysia tourism industry vulnerability. As a result, any small business collapse might lead to a chaotic recession in the hotel and tourist industry in the long run. The imposition of lockdown has completely interrupted the normal running of economies. The repercussions of the epidemic have been felt profoundly throughout the world tourist sector. Travel restrictions imposed to halt the coronavirus outbreak had an impact on a range of economic sectors. The Middle East suffered the most regionally, followed by Africa initially. Europe dominated the other area in terms of travel. The pandemic second wave changed the dynamic and the aviation of the hotel industry. The Middle East has suffered the most in terms of healthcare and economic growth, particularly in the tourist industry, with Africa not behind. In a summary, the COVID-19 accident has resulted in behavioral changes that have an impact on entrepreneurship, particularly SMEs. Through their inventiveness and creativity, SMEs have weathered the calamity. Their ability to respond to these changes is dependent on entrepreneurs' ability to maintain fresh ideas as well as the government development of the targeted monetary policy.